welcome to a special edition of King's Court. I'm Brian Dankulich, and we have the honor of having Dr. Michelle Schmude and Dr. Scott Weiland of our Mass Communications Department on tonight. Recently, they finished research on a hot topic in sports, concussions. Before we begin, Dr. Schmude, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and why you chose to conduct this study with Dr. Weiland.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Michelle Schmude, and I'm the chair of the Mass Communications Department. And I'm excited to be here on King's Court tonight to talk about the study that Dr. Weiland and I conducted on concussions and media awareness of those concussions when it has to do with college athletes. And so we began looking, really the idea was formulated when I was at a 13-year-old football game and 3 of the boys were taken off the field on stretchers with concussions. Around that same time, there was a lot of media attention around the $30 million that the NFL gave to the Army to do some concussion research. And so I came into the office one day, started talking with Dr. Weiland about what I had experienced the previous day, and really the idea was born on why don't we do something with our respective field, the mass communications field, and parlay that with concussions with college athletes. And so that's how Dr. Weiland and I started to really formulate our ideas around our concussion study.
Okay. And Dr. Weiland, a little bit about yourself and why you chose to work with Dr. Schmude.
Well, Michelle and I are colleagues in the Mass Communications Department. Been here back at King's. I'm an alumni, so I'm very glad to be back. Second year as a full-time faculty member and taught a year here part-time as well. And when Dr. Schmude and I began talking about this topic, it was very clear that it was something that was near and dear to both of us. I had suffered my first concussion as an athlete as a junior in high school, where I was struck by a baseball and had suffered several concussions while playing football here at King's. And so when we decided that we were going to tackle this project, it certainly became something that meant something personal to both of us.
Okay, interesting. Now that that is out of the way, what is the title of your research and why did you choose that title?
Well, I can read it to you. It's Student Athletes' Perceptions of Concussions Through Media Consumption. And what we looked to do here was we had 2 hypotheses, and we'll sort of paraphrase them. But our first hypothesis was that we were looking to see if there was a correlation between how student athletes consume information from the media and concussions.
Okay. And Dr. Schmude, concussions are a big topic in sports, especially football, from junior leagues to the NFL. What has your study concluded?
Well, the study, our hypothesis was really trying to determine that for those college athletes, if you sustained a concussion, were you more likely to research the long-term health effects associated with concussions? And our study did prove that those college athletes who suffered concussions, it was statistically significant that they were utilizing various media vehicles to research the long-term health effects at a higher rate than those athletes who did not suffer concussions.
And was the conclusion what you expected?
Well, that's what we hypothesized, and so yes, we were excited that what we believed to be the case actually did come through in terms of the research based on what the college athletes said in response to the survey questions.
Okay. And Dr. Weiland, how long was your study and who exactly was involved in the study?
Well, we looked at student athletes from King's College, Misericordia University, and Wilkes University, and we looked. The group of student athletes that we looked at were primarily the athletes that participated in fall sports. So we looked at soccer, we looked at field hockey, we looked at football, and we also looked at basketball as they tail into the conclusion of the fall as well. So we looked at athletes from those particular sports, and we looked at those particular colleges and universities. And the reason why we chose those particular sports was the data was telling us that those were the types of student athletes in this period during the year who were the most likely perhaps to suffer a concussion while participating in their sport.
Okay. Did the numbers you received back on responses exceed or target your expectations?
the number of responses that we received was appropriate for our sample size. And so I don't believe that the study is generalizable outside of Division III and the MAC. So what we really looked at were schools within the Middle Atlantic Conference, which King's is a part of, and that's how we selected Misericordia University and Wilkes University. That was not the only reason. They were close in terms of geographical proximity, and so they have similar students to King's as well. So the population was definitely very similar, and they had the same sports teams as what we did. And so therefore, you know, can it be generalizable to Division I? No, because we didn't survey Division I athletes. So I would definitely say this study is specifically focused on Division III and colleges and universities within the Middle Atlantic Conference. And obviously, primarily, it was focused here in Northeast Pennsylvania.
Okay. Were coaches eager to express concern about the research, or did you try and stay away from talking to coaches?
Well, I'll say that when we reached out to the athletic departments of the three different institutions, they were very interested in participating, very encouraging. They were very interested in finding out the results of the study. And the reason why, I think, is because it's an issue that affects everyone. Right. And they have a great, from dialoguing with them, it was very clear that they have a great amount of care for their student athletes. And so it made a lot of sense for them to jump into this important project.
Okay. This was a blind study, meaning you didn't know the names of who you talked to, correct?
That's correct. It was anonymous and confidential.
Right. Okay. So how did that translate, and do you think athletes were more apt to talk to you since you were doing it privately?
Well, I would think that it might have something to do with it. In my experience in conducting research, at times I think individuals can be a bit more comfortable in disclosing some private details. Not so private, but things that affect them and affect their lives. And so it might have had an impact on the response rate. It certainly changed our approach, and it changed the process for which we needed to achieve approval from the institutional review board. So I think that there may have been something there. Sure.
I would agree with Dr. Weiland on that, especially when we asked the college athletes if you ever sustained a concussion, yes or no. If they sustained a concussion, yes, they were then asked, did you report it? I think it's especially pertinent for those individuals that did say they did not report it. And I think that they were more comfortable disclosing that they didn't report it, and for the various reasons that they did not report the concussion. And primarily, some of the reasons why they didn't report the concussion was the mentality that they didn't want to lose any playing time. They didn't want to lose their starting position. And so these are obviously of grave concern, both to myself and Dr. Weiland. And so I think that they were more comfortable answering those questions honestly because it was anonymous and confidential, as opposed to us actually going to one respective team and trying to interview students who had concussions or things of that nature.
Okay. Why do you think students or athletes forgo concussion testing and pass it off as regular headache or something treatable?
Well, I think it goes back to what Dr. Schmude said here, is that at the end of the day, the athletes want to play. They want to be on the field, and they want to participate in those particular sports. And so if there's a fear that they'll lose their starting job or won't see the field, then they might not be as apt to report it.
And, I think there's an educational awareness going on as well. Some may just think that, oh, it's a headache, and it could be a slight concussion. And so the more education that we have out there, both for, boys who are competing in midget football in high school, college athletes and NFL players, or any type of athlete who is participating in high contact sports where concussions are prevalent, I believe the more education that they have to, I don't want to say diagnose, but to understand that they might have a concussion, will better serve them in the long run.
Okay. Are symptoms other than a headache, are symptoms other than a headache, which is close to other illness forms?
Well, we're not going to step outside of what our areas of expertise are. We're not physicians, but certainly there are some telltale signs to what you can expect to see from a player who has been concussed. It could be anything from complaining of a headache to vomiting. There are many things that you can look for to visually to see if something has happened.
Okay. How did you come to the decision to pick the colleges involved in your study?
Well, first and foremost, since we work here at King's, this population was near and dear to our heart, and we really started out with just looking at the King's population and then said, how can we make this study more valid and more applicable to a larger audience? And that's where we decided, well, why don't we add Misericordia and Wilkes University? And so that's how we decided to add Wilkes and Misericordia. You know, we had discussed the University of Scranton and Marywood University, but as you know, they don't have football teams. Right. And football, besides football, ice hockey would be the second sport that has the highest in terms of the, of concussions. And so we were trying to look at schools that were similar in nature to us, student composition, but also had the same teams.
Right,
and so that's really how we came up with Wilkes, Misericordia, and King's College.
And you mentioned hockey. Was hockey also included in your study?
Hockey was not included, although we did utilize some studies out of Canada from the Canadian Hockey League to support our theoretical framework and contribute to our relevant literature. But because Wilkes, King's, and Misericordia does not have, they do not have teams that are NCAA Division III sanctioned for ice hockey, we did not utilize any of that information as far as surveying club teams or any student athletes that might participate on a club or intramural level. So no, we did not look at that.
Okay. In 2009, Washington State passed a law on concussions. Since that time, every state except Mississippi has passed the same legislation. Pennsylvania's law includes coaches taking training courses once a year. Students with concussion symptoms must be removed from play, and then they must be medically cleared to return for play. And starting next July, schools may penalize coaches who don't comply. Do you think Pennsylvania's legislation, which took effect in July of 2012, does enough to help curb the concussion trend, or is it just skimming the surface?
Well, both Dr. Schmude and I have very strong feelings on this. I think what we'd really like to see is first a very thorough process, an education process take place where, and Dr. Schmude could talk about that, but what I'll say is this, I think the culture of the locker room needs to change, where players need to feel comfortable and come forward when they've suffered this type of injury, and in many cases they might not feel comfortable enough to do that. So it is an education process, but it also is a cultural issue, I think, that needs to be addressed in these locker rooms.
Okay. Recent studies have pointed to making sports safer. I know you're not medical doctors, but did you have any insight from players onto how to make things safer for them on the field or the court?
Sure. We actually asked a follow-up question. If they did receive a concussion, did they alter their level of play after they received their concussion? And, you know, some of the comments were, I didn't go for headers, I didn't nearly tackle as hard. Those were just some of the comments. They didn't go full force because they were concerned about receiving another concussion and what it would do to their long-term health. And so I think that there is an awareness out there. The more that we can do to educate the more we can do to educate the larger population, not just college athletes, about concussions, how to diagnose concussions, and how to educate them in terms of the long-term health effects of concussions can only better serve, you know, King's College, Wilkes University, Misericordia, and the larger population as a whole, because, you know, there are the long-term health effects and in terms of cost for the healthcare system is extraordinary. And so if we could better educate people up front about these issues, you know, we're not going to ever have 100% in terms of people wanting education about this. If we can educate more people than what are educated right now, then I think we're doing our job with this survey. And by utilizing new media technologies, I believe that we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, and just also what I also like to interject here is that a lot of the feedback that we're getting is what can we do to improve the equipment that athletes are wearing as they're playing. And we have seen recently that the NFL and the military and other groups are joining together to invest resources in coming up with the next generation, if you will, of equipment that might help protect athletes from sustaining these concussions. But whether or not that stands to be is a whole other study that should be done.
Okay. And finally, both of you have young sons. If they wanted to play a contact sport such as football, would you let them, knowing what you know now about the risk of concussions?
That's actually how this study started. My son has played football since he's been in second grade, and it was late in August. I was watching the Today Show before I was getting ready for work, and Roger Goodell of the NFL, the commissioner of the NFL, was on and was talking about, you know, the money that they were giving for concussion research, and that really you shouldn't let your children play football until they're 13 years old. And it was really an aha moment for me. I said to myself, wow, I've been letting Jeffrey play, that's my son, since he's been in second grade. And I forget what day that was, but then the following Sunday, that's when the three boys were taken off the field on stretchers with concussions. And for me, it was really the aha moment of, I need to do more research on this so I could be better educated as a parent, so that Jeffrey could be better educated if he is going to play this contact sport, so that he knows what to look for. But how can, you know, as a researcher and as a faculty member, utilize this information to help others? And that's when I came in and I asked Dr. Weiland, I said, hey, did you ever have a concussion when you played here at King's? And then we started talking about this, and Scott gave me some ideas, and we really started to sink our teeth into this, and we got really excited about it. And yes, Jeffrey does still play football and basketball and baseball. And so am I concerned? Yeah, every game that he plays, I'm concerned about it. Hopefully I'm better aware of the situation, and they do have athletic trainers. So anyway, that's my long story.
My wife and I have a 4.5-year-old little guy, and if you're watching this, you're never playing football. But seriously, what we would like him to understand are the risks that are involved with playing. And if he gets to 12 or 13 years old and he understands the seriousness of the kinds of things that can happen as you're playing football, then we will support him in that decision. But until he understands the ramifications of and the long-term effects of suffering these types of injuries, then I think we won't accept that request when he comes to us to ask for it.
Thank you both for your time in studying this topic and for joining us here tonight. And now it's on to Joe Goss, who has your King's Corner for the upcoming week in King's Athletics.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian, for having us.
No problem. No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Dr. Weiland and Dr. Schmude. Welcome to King's Corner, where we update you on the past week in King's Athletics and get you ready for the upcoming week. It was a historic week in King's sports, as both the men's and women's soccer team competed in the championship game of the MAC Freedom Conference. The women's team lost 3-1 against Misericordia. The men got a 2-1 victory over FDU Florham to win their first ever Freedom Conference championship game and advance to their first ever NCAA tournament game. The men will host the game this coming Thursday at 6 p.m. In other sports, the women's swim team will host Lebanon Valley College this Friday at 6 p.m. The women's basketball team will be away at Frostburg State University at 6 p.m. on Saturday. And the men's basketball team will host Penn State Scranton at 7 p.m. on Friday. And, of course, the big game when King's faces arch rival Wilkes University to end their season. King's came back to earth a little bit this past Saturday, by losing to Widener University at Widener 52-20 to end their 5-game winning streak. Wilkes University suffered a heartbreaking loss, 31-27, against Delaware Valley, at Delaware Valley this past week. Kings will have to stop the rushing attack of Pat Ngoli, who rushed for 130 yards this past week against Delaware Valley, and the passing attack of quarterback Taylor Young. That's it for this week on Kings Court. Thanks again to Brian, Dr. Weiland, and Dr. Schmude. I'm Joe Goss, and please join us again next week for Kings Court.